So welcome everyone to the Frontiers in Karst Colloquium. This is a talk series that's put on in collaboration between the Karst Waters Institute and the Carbonate Critical Zone Research Coordination Network. And this is the third in the spring talk series. And if you can see the previous talks here on the slide, if one of these looks interesting to you, you can go back and look at those online from the Karst Waters Institute website. We also had 3 talks last fall semester, and those are archived online as well. So if any of those looks interesting to you, feel free to take advantage of that resource. So today I'm excited to welcome Andrew Shaughnessy for our final talk for this semester. Andrew got his undergrad degrees or a degree at St. Louis University. He got degrees both in chemistry and in environmental science. And he's currently a PhD student at Penn State. Looking at his CV, I just wanted to brag on him a little bit. As a PhD student, he's already got 5 first author papers. So he's clearly a very productive scientist as well. So we're excited to welcome Andrew to tell us about some of his latest work on stream chemistry. And with that, I'll hand it over to Andrew.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see here, I'll pull this up. All right, are we good? Can everyone see this? Wonderful. Okay, so thank you all for coming here today. I'm excited to be sharing some of the work we've been doing at the Shale Hills Critical Zone Observatory here at Penn State, looking at, reading stream chemistry and weathering reactions in the critical zone. And so I think it's very fitting for this critical zone carbonate seminar series. And so with that, we'll just jump right in. And I like to always start with thinking about how we think about weathering in the critical zone and how that pertains to CO2 dynamics. And so oftentimes over long geologic timescales, we think of rock weathering processes as modulating atmospheric CO2 processes, or atmospheric CO2. And so here in this schematic diagram, what you can see is that we have this is a schematic diagram of the silicate cycle. So thinking of, silicate weathering on land as sequestering CO2, that precipitating as marine calcite in the ocean, being subducted and metamorphosed, and then re-released to the atmosphere via volcanism. And again, this cycle continuing. One thing that's been, made to one picture that's kind of been neglected in the classic silicate cycle is this idea of carbonate weathering coupled to sulfuric acid. And so as this reaction shows you here on the bottom, that this carbonate being dissolved by sulfuric acid actually releases CO2 back to the atmosphere over these same timescales. And so this is a picture that people have been interested in thinking about. And so my work mainly has focused on sulfide oxidation, which is going to be this in situ mechanism of delivering sulfuric acid to carbonates. And so when sulfide minerals oxidize, they release sulfuric acid, which often dissolve minerals in close proximity to them, oftentimes that mineral being carbonates. And so here's a diagram from a recent publication looking at glacial interglacial cycles and release of CO2 through this coupling of pyrite and carbonate dissolution. And this is a really difficult thing to estimate how much sulfide is oxidizing, or this coupling between these two reactions. And recently in 2018, the global budget of pyrite oxidation has been reevaluated and found that previous to that was twofold underestimated. And so what I want to think about here with this project is, why is this difficult to estimate, and how can we have better estimations of pyrite oxidation? And so when we think about studying pyrite oxidation, oftentimes we turn to river chemistry. And the reason why is that the rivers are going to integrate the weathering across the entire drainage basin. And that's going to be important towards understanding kind of this averaged oxidation across the entire catchment, or the entire critical zone. And one thing that becomes difficult is that stream chemistry is never really just from one source. And so sulfate in streams comes from many different sources, including acid rain, there's gypsum dissolution, there's pyrite oxidation, there's many sources that can go into a stream. And so what I'm going to call unmixing here is trying to separate these sources in stream to know information about weathering. And so oftentimes when people try and model this, they will assume some end members in their stream, and they'll try and unmix it using an inversion process. And this works well in some cases when you can really constrain a system, but oftentimes is difficult because you rely on this idea of the end member chemistry staying constant with time or not varying with space. And as I'm going to show you here in the East Coast, where I am and where Shale Hills is located, that neither of those two assumptions are usually true. For example, here in this plot, we're looking at the sulfate concentration in rain over time here in central Pennsylvania. And we see that there's been this long-standing decrease in sulfate concentration. And so if we want to use an inverse model, thinking about how sulfate concentration, using measured sulfate concentrations in the rain, we have to know something about this deposition to export lag in order to use the proper concentration of sulfate in this inversion. Otherwise, if we use the full measured range, we usually say that, okay, the sulfate in the river is somewhere between 0 and 100% from acid rain. And that's not helpful to anybody. Additionally, when we think about things being spatially homogeneous, that oftentimes isn't true either. And so when people are studying pyrite oxidation, they usually turn to these sulfur isotopes and sulfate. And if you have, again, a really well-constrained system with one lithology that only has one sulfur isotope for pyrite, like this bottom case here, you can get this, very clear mixing line, and you'd be able to unmix this signal. However, oftentimes, especially when you're draining a mixed lithology watershed or in a complex lithology watershed that has many, I guess the pyrite composition is really variable, and that's been found to be the case in a lot of catchments where you have something more like this top bar here, where the isotopes of the pyrite can actually vary widely and span, again, the entire measured range, leading to, okay, my stream is somewhere between 0 and 100% from pyrite, which again is not helpful when trying to unmix the signal. And so what we're going to try and do here is we're using a new machine learning model. And the basis of this model is going to be exactly what we were talking about before, the coupling between mineral dissolutions. And so as pyrite oxidizes, it produces this acid, dissolving the rocks around it. And these coupling of these mineral reactions actually imprint a pattern in the stream chemistry that we're going to try and deconvolve using some machine learning. And so the approach we're going to use is going to take both just the measured stream chemistry, and we're going to derive the end member chemistry that best describes that stream chemistry, as well as the mixing proportions simultaneously. And the way that we do that is through this technique called non-negative matrix factorization. And it's a mouthful. I'm just going to call it NMF for the rest of the talk here. And I'm going to walk through exactly how we go about this and how we interpret it. And one thing that I'm going to note here is that with NMF, even though we're decomposing the data into its sources, we don't actually know what those sources are. This is up to the domain scientist then to read the chemistry of these sources and determine what they're telling you. And that's going to be kind of what the rest of this talk is going to be geared towards. Okay, so we're going to start at Shale Hills, where we have a lot of data on the rock chemistry, the soil chemistry, the water chemistry, the groundwater chemistry, the atmosphere. We have every measurement under the sun here at Shale Hills. So we're going to think really critically about using this model at Shale Hills. And then I'm going to apply it to two other watersheds where we don't have that same kind of level of information. And so here in Shale Hills, which is one of the subcatchments in the Susquehanna Shale Hills Critical Zone Observatory, the underlying geology is shale. It's a completely forested land use, and we're going to use 2 years of daily stream chemistry. So starting at this slide and for the next about 6, I'm going to really walk through the model in pretty excruciating detail. If you're not a modeling person, zone out. I'll come back to the science here in about 5 slides. But what we do is we start with this time series of chemistry. So what we see here is time on the X and concentration on the Y. The colors are different chemical constituents that we're going to use in this model. So they're going to be calcium, chloride, potassium, magnesium, sodium, and sulfate. That's going to be all of the elements that or the species we're going to use in our model. And we start with this time series. And just to a first order, what we can see is that the major cations are all highest in concentration in the dry season, lowest in concentration in the wet season. And that pattern is going to be reversed for the anions, where sulfate and chloride are actually highest in concentration in the wet season. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to normalize all of our solutes to sulfate. And we're going to do this for a couple of reasons. One, when we are looking at mixing, taking the element ratios or the concentration ratios actually removes the effects of dilution and evapotranspiration that can occur. And additionally, when we normalize to sulfate, we're specifically delineating the mixing proportions of sulfate. And I think that that concept is sometimes kind of difficult to think about, but you have to remember our goal here is to say how much of this stream sulfate using this model is coming from pyrite oxidation. And then can we read this in terms of weathering processes in the critical zone? And so I like to give a little bit of an example here for people who don't think about mixing models often. So if we think about, we have these two sources of water and I mix them in an 80-20 ratio to get my mixture, I can unmix the stream sample using a very simple 2N member mixing model. And you're just gonna have to trust my math that it comes back out and I got 80% of water came from source 1. If I wanted to know, okay, if I know 80% of the water came from that source and I wanna know how much sulfate came from that source, it's a pretty easy calculation again that we take the sulfate concentration from that end member divided by the total sulfate in the mixture times the amount of water that came from that source to get that only 7% of the sulfate came from that first source. Now, if we are going to do this again, when we want to target a specific solute and say, what is the mixing proportion for that solute, we can normalize by that solute and model that directly. And so here again is going to be the same 2N member mixing model, but instead of concentrations, I'm using concentration ratios. And what we find is directly that source 1 contributes 7% of the total sulfate. And so again, this is just me reiterating why we're going to be normalizing all of the solutes to sulfate in this particular model. Great. So the next step that we're going to do is we're going to generate a bootstrap data set. And that's kind of a fancy data analytics term for we're going to fit a distribution to the data set and then increase the data volume for a more robust decomposition. And so the way that we're going to do this is we're going to use a multivariate normal distribution of log transformed element ratios. Again, that's a mouthful. So we're just going to think about this. What we're going to do is we're going to take the data set and we're going to match the bootstrap data set, the mean of the log transformed element ratios, and the covariation matrix between them. And so this is kind of highlighted here on the right-hand panel here, where you can see this is a density distribution of red being the true distribution of this chloride to sulfate ratio in the stream, and the black being our bootstrap distribution. And one good thing, again, using this multivariate normal distribution is we also maintain covariation of analytes. And that's going to be key because, again, we're looking at these coupled mineral reactions. And so, again, these black data points being our bootstrap data, and this red data points being the true stream chemistry that we've measured. And using this bootstrap data set technique, what we actually end up doing is we reduce overfitting of the model, and that essentially provides a more robust decomposition. It also fills out the distribution in places where we might not have sampled the stream as much. Again, overarchingly making a more robust decomposition when we actually step into the modeling phase. Okay, so then again, next step after this is we need to figure out how many end members we're going to decompose the data into. And so one key feature of NMF is it's aiming to make the chemistry or the matrix that it's decomposing as sparse as possible. So if you add too many components, physically, when you look at the chemistry of the end member, it will stop making sense. And so we need to think about how many end members do I need to decompose my data into? And we set a criteria for this. And so what we do is we use PCA, or principal component analysis, and we say, what is the minimum number of dimensions that I need or components in PCA to explain 90% variance of the data? And we're going to set the number of end members that we're going to decompose to that value. And so for Shale Hills, that ends up being 2. And so this is, again, components versus percent of variance explained. And after 2 components, we have 90%. So that's where we're going to set our cutoff for this model. All right, and then the last step here is we're actually going to apply the NMF model. And this last step is actually the big one, right? So we're going to train the model using the bootstrap data set, and then we're going to apply our trained model to the measured stream chemistry. And then we're going to take those data, we're going to collect them, and then we're going to repeat that process 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 times. And the reason why we do it so many iterations is, one is that this is a non-unique solution, because you can imagine that dividing all the components by 2 and multiplying all of the end member chemistries by 2 will end up getting the same value. So again, we iterate so many times to be able to make a more robust decomposition because this is a non-unique solution. And then what we do after that is we take all those models that we fit to the data and we apply some filtering criteria to filter out poor fitting models. And for the sake of time today, I'm not going to go into the filtering procedure so much, but if you have questions, I'm more than happy to come back to it. And then at the end of the day, this is kind of what we end up with, which is we start with our samples, which are going to be these element ratios in the columns, time points in the rows. We're going to decompose it into two matrices of proportions in each row, time periods, or proportions in each column, time periods in each row, times this end member composition matrix, which is going to be element ratios in each column, and then the end member itself into each of the rows. So again, this is kind of an abstract way of thinking about it. I'm going to put some numbers to this to make this a little bit easier to follow. But I wanted to give a quick summary of how this whole process works here. And so when we think about a traditional mixing model, what we do usually is we assume the end members, we measure the stream chemistry, we invert, and we get mixing proportions. What we're doing in our model here is we're actually just measuring the stream chemistry, we're figuring out the components with PCA, and then we're applying NMF to both derive the end member chemistry and the mixing proportions. With the key being that we don't know the identity of the end member, and that's what we're going to interpret through looking at the patterns in the data. And just a quick side here, we've worked on this model a lot in generating, synthetic data sets that we know all of the answers to these questions and putting it through our modeling process to make sure that we're actually getting the right answers back. And so this is just a quick 2 end member example of our synthetic data set. Saying, this is, again, the true mixing proportions we give it and the true end member chemistries, the ratios, and we've modeled them pretty well, matching the synthetic data sets. So again, this is a good, robust decomposition that, if all the data works out, it seems to be doing a pretty good job. And we've run many of these synthetic data sets, and I'm happy to go into details about these later if people have questions. Great, so let's look at an actual output from Shale Hills. And so these are the 2 matrices that get output from the model. So we have the component matrix, again, which each row being the mixing, or each column being the mixing proportion, and each row in the composition matrix, or in this composition matrix describing the chemistry of each of these end members. And I've put in some of the standard errors after the 20,000 decompositions, just to show you some of the range that we can get from the errors. Okay, so this is where we have to stop thinking as a data scientist. We're going to take that hat off, and people who don't like modeling can come back in now, because we're going to start thinking like a geoscientist. The model is done. We're not going to think about it anymore. We're going to interpret our results here. And so this is the composition matrix that we get. And I'm going to think about this now in a geologic context of Shale Hills. How can we interpret this matrix that we get? And so this here is a cross section of Shale Hills. And one thing that is really important to think about for Shale Hills is we have 2 predominant flow zones that have been studied for quite a long time here at Shale Hills. One of these flow zones is going to be this groundwater flow that's flowing mostly through this carbonate and pyrite reaction front. And so for people who don't think about reaction fronts in the critical zone, what a reaction front is going to be, and we're just going to simplify it for the purpose of this talk, is going to be anywhere above this line, there is none of the mineral. Anywhere below this line, none of the mineral has weathered. So it's all of the mineral, the reaction happening at this front, and then none of the mineral above it. And that's, again, it's going to be a little simplified version for Shale Hills, but that's the way we're going to think about it. And so what we find here is that the carbonate and the pyrite reaction fronts are co-located at Shale Hills. And what we find is in this shallow intermediate interflow layer that we're going to call it, we see co-location of illite and chlorite, with chlorite maybe being a little bit deeper than the illite front. But again, these 2 predominant flow zones. So when we think about this end member matrix that we see, we can think about this in terms of these 2 flow components, where we see high calcium to sulfate and high magnesium sulfate ratios in one of the end members. And that might be indicative of this co-dissolution of pyrite and carbonate along this deep flow path, where the sulfate then is going to be indicative of pyrite oxidation. And then when we look at the other component here, what we find is there's still a high magnesium sulfate ratio, but we also see a high chloride sulfite ratio. And what we might think about in this is that this, again, is going to be this dissolution along this interflow layer, where the magnesium might represent chlorite and illite dissolution, and this chloride coming from the atmospheric deposition, which is really the only source of chloride here at Shale Hills. And therefore, the sulfate that we're going to attribute to this flow path is going to be predominantly acid rain derived. And again, this is the conceptualization. And then we also have some supporting evidence to support these two flow paths with our data. And so here what I'm showing is going to be sulfate concentration versus the 34S isotope ratio of sulfate in that sample. And these dashed lines up here are going to be the typical range that we see acid rain. And then the dashed lines down here are going to be what we're inferring the pyrite delta 34S to be at Shale Hills. And what we find is that as we go from low concentration to high concentration, we see that isotopes start to lean more towards pyrite oxidation, or the pyrite-derived 34S. I should note that all of the points in these plots are contoured to this alpha deep, and I'm going to use this kind of notation for the rest of the talk, where alpha is going to stand for mixing proportion, and deep is going to be this deep weathering flow path. And what we found, again, thinking about this, is we have the shallow weathering flow path and this deep weathering flow path at Shale Hills. And so alpha deep being the proportion of sulfate from that deep weathering flow path. And then on this right-hand plot, what we can see is that this is going to be the concentration of pyrite-derived sulfate as interpreted from the NMF model, and versus the saturation index for calcite. And what we see is as the sulfate derived from pyrite oxidation increases, we're seeing that the calcite saturation is approaching or reaching equilibrium, in some cases oversaturated. And the way we interpret this, again, and this has been something that has been interpreted at Shale Hills for a while, is that flow paths that flow through the co-location of carbonate and pyrite reaction fronts, actually, as pyrite oxidizes, it drives the calcite or the carbonate in the system to dissolve, which again approaches then equilibrium with the calcite in the system. So these are two lines of evidence to kind of support our idea that the NMF decomposition is related to these flow paths, which are related to these stratified reaction fronts, and that the deep flow path indicates pyrite oxidation and the shallow flow path indicates acid rain. Okay, so if we can believe that that's what our model is showing us, then what we can do then is we can think about the weathering fluxes at Shale Hills. And so again, I like to think about pyrite oxidation because I study mostly pyrite. So I threw this one in here to start. And what we can think about is this is a time series of sulfate being the black line, which we saw way back in the beginning of the talk. And then we've decomposed this into its two components, acid rain and pyrite. And so what we see is that in the summer months, or in the dry season, there's actually the highest concentration and proportion of pyrite-derived sulfate. And in the winter months, you can think about here, there's the lowest concentration and lowest proportion of pyrite-derived sulfate. And we find that pyrite oxidation only accounts for about 23% of the total sulfate flux at Shale Hills. And this is actually pretty consistent with the most of the northeastern United States, where acid rain has completely dominated sulfate dynamics in most of these small forested watersheds. And so that, again, is maybe us thinking that our model is doing a good job at delineating the two flow components, because this is likely a realistic number for Shale Hills. And I put the equation that I'm using for flux up here. I'm happy to discuss more of the actual calculations if people have questions. And then I'm going to add just a quick note that there's these big gaps in the Shale Hills time series, because this is when the tubing froze on our autosampler. So just a short little aside there. Great, and I thought I'd throw in a slide for carbonate weathering, because this is the carbonate seminar series. We're thinking about carbonates. And so again, thinking about our system, we can take these derived end members and we can actually do more with this data. Now that we've derived these end members, we can think about what is the calcium sulfate ratio in that deep weathering end member and the magnesium sulfate ratio in that deep weathering end member. And we can say that the calcium and magnesium in that flow path are likely going to be mostly from carbonate dissolution. And we can split that signal further into its components of calcite dissolution and anchorite dissolution. And so at Shale Hills, these are our two predominant carbonate minerals. I gave you the formula for anchorite up here in the upper right-hand corner. The fluxes for calcium are roughly equally split between the two. But again, thinking that anchorite has twice the cations as calcite does, the actual weathering rate of anchorite is about twice as high, which is consistent with double the abundance of anchorite at Shale Hills compared to calcite. And then additionally, what we can do is we can think about these end member chemistries in terms of sulfuric versus carbonic acid dissolution. And again, we'd hypothesized that this deep weathering flow path, because of pyrite oxidation, would actually be mostly sulfuric acid driven dissolution of carbonates. But what we actually find when looking at the data is that is not the case. And that even though this flow path goes through the pyrite oxidation front, pyrite has a relatively small abundance in the shale at Shale Hills. And that carbonate dissolution is actually mostly driven by carbonic acid, not by sulfuric acid, where only 16% of this dissolution is driven by sulfuric acid. Great, and then I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on this slide, but we can also break down the shallow weathering end member into the different clays that dissolve. And so this is that same kind of anchorite curve we saw in the last plot, but this is going to be for the magnesium component of anchorite. And then we have these two other magnesium-bearing minerals at Shale Hills, chlorite and illite. And other studies have looked at the shallow groundwater at Shale Hills and have noted that the majority of the water in the shallow groundwater wells are indicative of chlorite dissolution rather than illite dissolution. And when we look at our data, what we actually see is that the shallow weathering flow path is 90% chlorite dissolution magnesium versus 10% illite, which is again consistent with the shallow groundwater chemistry that has been investigated before. Okay, so we're going to leave Shale Hills for a second, and I'm just going to apply this model now to two other watersheds, and we're going to discuss those ones real quick, how they're a little bit different than Shale Hills, and then we're going to tie this back to the CO2 dynamics at the end for weathering in the critical zone. So our second watershed we're going to be looking at is going to be East River in Colorado, and one thing that is interesting about East River and makes it different than Shale Hills is two things. One, it's not in a high acid rain impacted area of the United States. It's going to be in Colorado. And two, it's got about 10 times higher sulfide in the shale itself. So it's a high sulfide shale compared to Shale Hills, which is a very low sulfide shale. And we're going to use a year of daily stream chemistry. And again, when we look at the PCA, we see that there are, again, two end members. So we're going to decompose the stream chemistry into its two end members. And actually, recently, there was a study looking at this, again, weathering structure of East River. And again, very similar to Shale Hills, you see this zone where you have the co-location of carbonate and pyrite reaction fronts. And this, again, is very consistent with work done by Zhen Gu, who's looked at a bunch of these shale watersheds and seen that in shale watersheds, it's very common to have these deep reaction fronts of carbonate and pyrite and to see them co-located in shales. And so we're going to, again, interpret this high calcium magnesium as this deep weathering flow path and this high kind of chloride end member as going to be the shallow weathering flow path. And what we see then is at East River that we have a very high flux of pyrite-derived sulfate, and that what we see is almost all of the pyrite at East River is going to be derived from pyrite oxidation, and that's going to be 62% of the annual flux. And what we find too is thinking about these weathering reactions, where at Shale Hills, it was only about 15% of the carbonate dissolution was driven by sulfuric acid. At East River, we see about 30 to 70% of the carbonate dissolution being driven by sulfuric acid, and that's going to be seasonally varying, which is consistent with the estimates from Winnick et al., who said 35 to 75% of the weathering is driven by sulfuric acid. So again, thinking about how the model is performing and if this makes sense in the system. And again, this result is very different than Shale Hills, which would make sense given that the shale is very pyrite rich and that there's less acid rain. Great, so now we're going to come back to the East Coast and we're going to look at New Hampshire, and we're going to look at the Hubbard Brook catchment. And there are a bunch of subcatchments within Hubbard Brook, and we selected 5 of the subcatchments that haven't been experimentally treated. And the reason why we're going to look at Hubbard Brook is because unlike Shale Hills, it's not underlain by shale. It's going to be a schist and glacial till. But like Shale Hills, it's also been extensively impacted by acid rain. And now we're going to note a new difference as well, is that the PCA for this, for the stream chemistry here, shows that there are actually 3 end members in this catchment. So we're going to decompose the data into its 3 end members. And then this one is a little bit harder for me to interpret. So we're going to just walk through how I thought about this. This is, a block of data and what do these numbers mean? Which minerals are present? How are we going to interpret the flow paths? So what I like to start with is thinking about other work that's been done in New Hampshire on these glacial till covered landscapes. And one thing that's been noted is that there's this common 3-layered system where you have this weathering of till, highly weathered till at the surface, this fresh, less weathered till under that, and then you've got the bedrock that is under that. And so we're going to start by thinking of these 3 end members as being related to these kind of 3 structures in this till covered landscape. And so one of the evidence, right, if we're thinking about, I want to know what's the dissolution of the sulfide mineral or what's the sulfide mineral contribution, the first thing we want to think about is that the sulfide oxidation should be time invariant. Excuse me. If we think about the dissolution of this mineral, we should think that over the course of 20 years, there's not going to be a big change in the oxidation rate of the mineral. However, there is going to be a big change in acid deposition, as we showed early in the presentation. And so when we look at the different component breakdowns for each of these kind of subcatchments, what we see is there's really only one component that is time invariant, where the other 2 components are decreasing with time. And so that's going to be this component 3, kind of like most easily seen in this W3 subcatchment, where you can see that the concentration of sulfate in this component doesn't change significantly with time. So we're thinking maybe that component 3 could be indicative of the sulfide mineral dissolution at Hubbard Brook, which in this case is not pyrite, but pyrrhotite, just a minor difference. And so we're going to investigate the chemistry of that end member. And so for that end member, what we see is that the most indicative chemistry as determined by NMF is going to be this high correlation between the potassium in the end member and the magnesium in the end member. And so we can think about, okay, well, if potassium and magnesium and sulfur from pyrrhotite are all dissolving together, well, minerals could be present. And that might be indicative of biotite coupling to the dissolution of pyrrhotite. And that's not such a big stretch to think about. Other studies that have looked at metashale tailings from mining operations that have low carbonates or no carbonates, similar to Hubbard Brook, they've seen that the first minerals to kind of dissolve as a function of sulfide oxidation are going to be minerals like chlorite and biotite. And since chlorite also has magnesium, biotite is potassium, magnesium, we're going to interpret the third component of Hubbard Brook to be dissolution along the deep weathering flow path of pyrrhotite coupled to the dissolution of biotite and or chloride. And then what we see at this, given that decomposition, is that acid rain makes up a very large, very vast majority of the rain at Hubbard Brook, or of the sulfate at Hubbard Brook, which again is consistent with the East Coast, most of the sulfate in the streams being derived from acid rain. And what we find is that this W3 subcatchment, that the weathering flux of pyrrhotite is going to be 6.3 millimoles per meter squared per year. And just for some context, that's, estimations of pyrrhotite dissolution or oxidation rates at Hubbard Brook have been estimated at about 5 millimoles per meter squared per year. So they're very consistent with previous estimations, given, our decomposition of the data. Okay, so we've gone through each of these 3 watersheds. We've thought about the different solutes, how we can decompose the solutes into their chemistry, their respective weathering reactions. Now let's tie this back to the beginning of the presentation where we think about weathering dynamics in terms of its CO2. And so I'm going to define a term here, which we call the CO2 sequestration capacity, or kappa. And kappa is going to have the units of moles of CO2 per equivalence of cation. And so I'm going to just keep that in your mind. And I want to compare the actual structure, the rock and soil chemistry of these catchments to the stream chemistry that we've been looking at throughout this talk. And what we find, again, these are very lengthy derivations, and I'm not going to walk you through all the math and bore you. But thinking about the stoichiometry of weathering reactions, these are the end products of what we get. And I'm just going to highlight some of the key things that we think about. And what we can see from these equations is there really is three main parts to the equation. And so the first part is going to be this first term here, which we can think about like what is the physical denudation relative to the chemical denudation, right? And so for the rock chemistry, we're going to define this as the mass transfer coefficient of cations at the land surface. And that is thinking about, if we have a mass of rock and it's weathering and it's coming to the surface, how much of that rock actually dissolves versus how much of it gets eroded away. And then Again, this is not totally equivalent, but you can think about it in a very similar context. Again, through the derivation, this kind of -1 comes out. But if you think about tau ranges from 0, meaning no dissolution of the mineral, it all gets eroded, to -1, meaning that it's completely dissolved at the top of the weathering profile. Then if we're looking at the stream chemistry, -1 here would make sense because we're only looking at the dissolved components. So we're not thinking about the physical component. Okay, so then there's the second part of these equations, which we call gamma. And we're thinking about, again, when we're thinking about weathering dynamics, we're saying, what is the ratio of silicate dissolution to carbonate dissolution in the watershed? And so we're going to define this term gamma, which is the proportion of cations either in the rock that are from carbonates or from our NMF decomposition, what is the proportion of cations in the stream that came from carbonate weathering, which we're going to define from that deep weathering end member. All right, and then the last thing here is going to be, what is this kind of ratio of CO2 to sulfuric acid in terms of weathering agent? And so for the rock, we're going to think about the in situ sulfuric acid generation by thinking about what's the relative abundance of pyrite compared to the total cations in the rock. And when we think about the stream, we're going to think about what is the sulfuric acid in the stream, either derived from acid rain or from pyrite oxidation, something along those lines, relative to the total cations in the stream. And so what this does is this gives us this kind of CO2 sequestration capacity, thinking of, again, and this is of your lengthier derivations, and you're just gonna have to maybe trust my math for the purposes of this talk. Happy to answer questions about these. But what we get then is we can plot these all up and think about how our systems work in terms of CO2 sources and sinks. And so I like to think of kappa, the CO2 sequestration capacity, as an efficiency term, right? So the reason why we like to use kappa instead of just straight fluxes is that you can compare the stream chemistry to the rock chemistry, because the range of kappa has to be between 0.25 and -0.5. And so just for, the notation here, when kappa is negative, we're sequestering CO2. And when kappa is positive, we're releasing CO2. And again, when we think of this term, I like the term thinking of it as efficiency, because if kappa is -0.5, you're at 100% efficient at drawing down CO2. You're only weathering silicate minerals, and you're only using CO2 to weather them. When your kappa is 0.25, you're 100% efficient at releasing CO2. You're only weathering carbonate minerals, and you're only using sulfuric acid to do it. And any other combination of weathering agent and mineral falls somewhere in between those two values. And what we can see is at Shale Hills and at East River, we intermittently switch between source and sink for CO2. And that, again, is based on these weathering reactions that are taking place. And interestingly, those switch are actually reversed for Shale Hills and East River in terms of time of year. So at East River, during base flow conditions, what we're finding is that East River is a source of CO2. And during snowmelt, it actually becomes a sink for CO2. However, at Shale Hills, it's almost the reverse, that during the wet season, we actually see that the system is a source of CO2, and during the dry season, it becomes a sink of CO2. And then at Hubbard Brook, because there are essentially no carbonate minerals, we find that Hubbard Brook is always a sink for CO2. And one thing to note, though, is that if you look in the time series on this end for Hubbard Brook, the values lie above maybe the range for what we think of as the long-term sequestration capacity as recorded in the rock and weathering profile, which is shown here on the kind of the margin. And that is also shown for Shale Hills, where oftentimes the values are above what's recorded in the rock. And one reason why that might be the case is because the rock, when we're looking at that, we're not considering acid rain deposition. And so in both Shale Hills and Hubbard Brook, acid rain is competing with CO2 to dissolve silicate minerals, actually lowering the capacity of the watershed to sequester CO2. And that is something that has been observed in other watersheds as well, that acid competition between sulfuric and CO2 actually reduces sequestration of CO2 through weathering in the critical zone. And then I wanted to throw up just we can convert these kappa streams into fluxes by thinking about, what is kappa stream times the discharge in the stream multiplied by that some cation. Because if you remember, This is the moles of CO2 per cation equivalent. So if we think about all of the cation equivalents in the stream divided by the area, we can convert kappa into these CO2 fluxes. We could also do this with kappa rock. However, we would need to know the erosion rates of the basins, because you could think of the flux, the long-term flux of CO2 being kappa rock times the erosion rate times the density of the bedrock times the concentration of cations in the bedrock. So, just to not complicate things, I didn't go too much into that. And some of these catchments don't have erosion rates listed for them or reported for them. Great. And so now that you know, that's our way of thinking about things, kind of concluding the remarks for the work that we've been doing is thinking about how can we look for patterns in stream chemistry and read the chemistry for weathering reactions that are taking place. And some of the key things we found is that this co-dissolution of minerals along characteristic flow paths in a watershed impart patterns in the stream chemistry that we can decipher using these machine learning techniques. And some other things we've noted is that watersheds can intermittently switch between sources and sink based on which reactions are dominant at which parts of the year. And lastly, we've noted that acid rain diminishes the capacity of a watershed to sequester CO2 by replacing CO2 with H2SO4 as a weathering agent. And overall, if we don't consider pyrite and carbonate when thinking about CO2 weathering budgets in these critical zone processes, we're always going to overestimate the drawdown of CO2 through weathering reactions. And with that, that's it. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, thanks, Andrew. Great talk. So now we'll take questions. If people want to enter questions into the chat, they can do that. Or if people want to ask a question with audio, maybe raise your hand and I can ask you to unmute and you can ask a question. So it looks like maybe Admin, you have a question?
Yes. Hi, Andrew. That was a really fascinating presentation. Very interesting work. I had a couple questions. One of them was for your NMF model. There, does the NMF model, does it unmix kind of you mentioned pathway. I'm trying to see the physical thing that it unmixes. Does it unmix the pathway passing through a certain source zone, or does it unmix mass from a source zone? Okay, so is it kind of the source zone or the pathway?
Good question. So the way I think about it is that it's more so unmixing the characteristic minerals that dissolve along a certain flow zone. And so I guess if you're thinking about like using the equations, it is a mass balance. But when we're imparting like how it's figuring out which minerals, that's going to be based on, kind of these pattern recognition within the data set itself. So it's going to be this covariability between certain elements at certain times of year that are indicative of groups of minerals dissolving, which we're then interpreting as these flow components. So again, NMF doesn't know anything about flow, doesn't know anything about the watershed. All it's looking for is patterns in the data set. And then what we've seen through looking at many of these watersheds is this often comes up as patterns indicative of groups of minerals that have these stratified reaction fronts.
Okay, great. And if I could ask another short question.
Yeah, sure.
For the first watershed, you seem to have a lot of data there. Have you tried running like a traditional mixing model and then comparing the outputs?
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that I didn't really get into too much today is along the northeastern United States, there's this big, I don't know if problem is the right word, but conundrum might be a better way to say it, where watersheds export more sulfate than is inputted into a watershed in any given year. And so there's this idea of this excess export. And so you can think about this export as being a lag in deposition to export of maybe this acid rain having charged up the watershed and is now crossing over to being a net exporter instead of a net retainer. Unless you know that lag time, it's impossible to use the measured stream or rain chemistry, because when you use the full range of chemistry, I think I mentioned at the beginning, your model says, okay, your mixing ratio is 0.5 plus or minus 0.5 for pretty much everything. So yeah, I have tried, and the problem is it becomes hard to constrain without understanding the lag times in the watershed.
Cool. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Looks like Jen has a question.
Andrew, coming at you from State College.
Hey, Jen.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask my usual question. This is maybe the second time I've heard you talk about this NMF model, and it's just super cool. And this is a tangential question, but it's I just have a weakness for this other question. So, if you're, well, let me just ask you a simpler question. Is the weathering of the pyrite in the deep reaction front biological or abiotic? And how do you know?
Great question. So this is actually something that Jin Gu has recently studied and has published a paper. Everyone should check it out. I love that paper. It's in Science, where they argue it's abiotic. And the reason why is that the matrix of the shale at Shale Hills, the pore throats are too small for any known bacteria to be able to get into there. So they argue that at the grain scale, diffusion of oxygen through the matrix is going to be what limits that oxidation rate. So it's going to be an abiotic mechanism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so now I'm going to go like, unless there's another question, I'm going to go like farther afield. So I have a system where our calculations show that almost all of the sulfide oxidation is biological. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is constrain different processes contributions to weathering by thinking about oxygen availability, because biologically or abiologically that's a real key thing. And so in this system there's a tectonic uplift, so the rocks are passing through a groundwater zone, rising up, not too different from denudation, but here there's a tectonic component as well, and some fraction of the carbonate weathering is sulfide oxidation, and some fraction of it is CO2. This is a radically different geometry and situation from Shale Hills, but I can already imagine a similar approach helping us to understand what fraction of the deep sulfidic water is contributing to the system. So I just love thinking about this landscape passing through this weathering front, and there are multiple sources of water, and there's this various reaction fronts, and I just think that your model is nice, or your approach, let's say, is really nice because it lends itself to this crossover between a silicate dominated watershed and one that's really dominated by carbonates, which is the kind of system that I think about most. So I just wanted to say that your research and approach is really exciting, and I think it's sort of exportable, and that's what I love about it. And I don't think anyone has really explored your approach to considering a carbonate dominated watershed, and I'm be curious to see what happens next.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I would love to try it on a carbonate dominated watershed. There's so many different variables to consider. I'll admit that we've tried this on watersheds that don't work well, so I think there are situations where it won't work. And one of these hypotheses where we think it won't work is when you don't get these stratified reaction fronts, or where there's different flow, where all the flow only sees one type of mineral, and so you don't get covariation between many elements. So there are situations where we haven't quite figured out exactly when it will and won't work well, and that's something we've been exploring actively.
Cool, thanks.
Lishan?
Hey, Andrew, good to see you. And I really enjoy your talk. So my question is about the demixing of two different end members. So how tolerant you are with the variability within the two end members, how different they might be with time in terms of like chemistry. I'm thinking about, your deep flow path where you have pyrite, you have carbonate. But let's say, calcite dissolution is controlled by carbon dioxide concentration, and that's very important for the carbon dioxide consumption. But we know that carbon dioxide might be a function of season, right? So your end member chemistry might be different depending on the time of the year. So how do you deal with that variability within the end member?
No, that's a great question. And so to answer your question, it's very flexible on in terms of how it derives the chemistry over the time of year. So in our particular model for Shale Hills, we actually do have the end member chemistry of that deep weathering end member change with time. And the way we do that is because when I evaluate the fit of the model, I evaluate the fit sample by sample and retain, again, some filtering criteria that I say for this sample, I retain, say, the 5th percentile best fitting models. And by doing it sample by sample, it allows the flexibility of the end member composition to change with time. And so we actually do see that that is something that the variability with time that we do see at Shale Hills and other sites as well.
Kind of to follow up, I think more for admin's question about the mixing is that when you separate, right, the contribution of sulfate or other constituents between two end members, can you also separate the water fluxes at the same time?
Great question. So I have tried that, and it is not something right now that I can do using the approach of the normalization. So usually what you can do is after you've normalized something, let's say I get 7% sulfate from pyrite oxidation. Well, if you know the concentration of sulfate in that particular end member, you can back calculate the water flux. However, because we do everything in ratios, and the NMF derives the answers in ratios, there's not a way to go from ratios back to just strict concentration, excuse me, in a way that gets at the water flux itself. And so if you wanted to set up the model itself without normalizing, you can set it up to do water fluxes. And that's something that is a way that you just have to set the model up in advance, where that's your target is going to be essentially your target is discharge instead of being the sulfate in my case.
Right, because that'll be super powerful because you have a C already, right? If you can get the Q, then you can establish, the CQ relationship.
Right.
But super cool. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, so we've also got a question from Penny Boston in the chat, and she asks, why do you elect to train your system on synthetic data rather than real data and then challenge with synthetic data? Did I understand you correctly?
Excuse me. So we trained the model. So I use the word bootstrap instead of synthetic because we also make synthetic data sets where I know the composition. So I'm going to use the word bootstrap for my training process. And so what that data set is going to be is I still don't know the mixing ratios and I still don't know the end member compositions. What I'm doing is just fitting a multivariate normal distribution. So to get at your first question is why do I train to that data set? Well, we found that when we just train the data to this true stream chemistry, you end up really overfitting the model on about, let's say, 50% of the data, where you're deriving some end member and 50% of the data really fits that end member well. And then the other 50% maybe just gets no results come back out of it. There's no valid models that come out of that procedure. But what we find is when we kind of smooth the distributions out using this multivariate normal approach, that you're kind of filling in the gaps of distribution where you're actually avoiding this overfitting process and you end up with many more valid fitting models. And then again, when we interpret those models after the fact, we see that the data makes more sense in terms of interpretability with the physical structure of Shale Hills or other watersheds. And then when I'm talking about the synthetic data sets that I had shown, I wanted to see, does this procedure yield valid results when I know the right answer? And so that's what I was doing in that case. When I talk about synthetic data, I know all the right answers and I'm just saying, can I get them back from the model? And the answer is usually yes, but like I said before, I can come up with situations where the answer is no.
I'll maybe ask a little bit of a follow-on to that, or maybe, okay, yes, she says thanks. So I have maybe a two-part question, which they're sort of related. This bootstrap process. So normally I think of bootstrap as like sampling from the actual data set, maybe sampling with replacement or something like that. But it sounds like you're actually using the data set to fit distributions. Is that right? Like you're determining an approximate distribution from the data set and then you're sampling from those.
Yes.
So I guess the second part of my question is how much data do you really need in order to do this at a site?
Great question. This is also something that we've really been working on. And so this is where the synthetic data sets, again, I use the words bootstrap and synthetic because we use both of these. So I'm going to say synthetic being the ones I know the answers. We've tested this exact question, thinking about if I only measure the stream chemistry 10 times, can I get the answer back? The answer is usually no. If I have 100 stream samples, can I get the answer back? Sometimes. And, you know, this is not an exact process because it also depends on how distinct the end members are. There's so many moving parts to this picture. But what we found is typically if you have about 200, 250 samples, that oftentimes we get the right answer back in this synthetic procedure. And so that's, again, getting back to how many samples is enough samples is a really tricky question. And I think there's a lot of work that can be done on how much is enough, because no one wants to collect 10,000 samples to be able to get a good modeling result. I would love to go take 2 and be done.
Yeah, this actually makes me think of the hydrologic benchmark network sites within the USGS network, which most of which have several hundred anyway samples. So that, I don't know, I wonder whether that's a place that you could go and look really across the whole US at what sort of,
Absolutely. And that's
maybe they're too
something
big of
that
catchments, but
yeah, I'm using many of the sites that you just talked about, and I'm working on actually upscaling. So the next part of this project is taking Shale Hills and upscaling to the entire northeastern United States, and then using, again, a lot of these long-term USGS sites that you're talking about to think about, you know, continentally how we can think about these processes of pyrite oxidation.
cool. Okay, do we have any more questions before we wrap things up here? I have at least one more question I'll ask, which if no one else has a question, which is maybe only, okay, no one else is stepping up. So it's maybe only tangentially related to your work, but I was curious about this co-location of the pyrite weathering and the carbonate weathering, and the fact that you were seeing that whether or not the carbonate weathering was dominated by the sulfuric acid component.
Right.
So I'm curious if there's some understanding as to why those weathering fronts are co-locating, even if you don't have carbonate weathering primarily being driven by sulfuric acid generated from the pyrite.
That's a good question. I'm not, you know, totally sure that I have a good answer for you on that front. One thing that I think that Zhengu has been thinking a lot about this process, actually Li Shin might have also thought about this a lot, but I do know that when you think about pyrite and carbonate, a lot of times what we like to start with thinking is there enough carbonate to buffer all the sulfuric acid that's produced from pyrite? And I think that's one reason why you don't get pyrite above maybe the carbonate reaction front, is that there's so much carbonate to be able to buffer all of that. You know, this is something that is a great question that I am not sure that I'm the most equipped to answer for you.
Sure, yeah, I thought it might be a bit off to the side.
But I think it's related to the infiltration of gases, because
okay.
as you know, Jen asked the question about oxygen to oxidize the pyrite, and then you need carbon dioxide to oxidize the, you know, not oxidize, to dissolve the carbonate, right? So it's all depends on the gas which is coming from the liquid, the soil gases. So that might be why they're coupled.
That's actually what I was wondering, if it was somehow related to availability of oxygen and CO2. Which I think in karst systems is one of the interesting things, is that you can have these gases penetrate quite deeply and also along quite heterogeneous surfaces, you know, along conduits and fractures and so on.
Yeah,
and also related to how they're exposed, probably, like, sorry, Andrew, to cut you off, but it's more like the breakdown of the shale, so that all these surface of these minerals are exposed, right? That's part of it too.
Yeah, and I was just going to put in there too that oftentimes we see these two locations at approximately the water table, and so in the thickness of these fronts being approximately the amplitude of change in water table seasonally. And so again, that has to do with what Li Shin was saying of bringing these dissolved gases down to the water itself. And so that's somewhere I think that something people have been working on actively, and I think especially at Shale Hills and at East River, where they've been thinking about these two processes of where those reaction fronts are located.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks again for a great talk, Andrew, and thanks everyone for contributing to an interesting discussion. And with that, we'll
Thanks, Matt.
wrap
Andrew.
it up. Maybe we'll see you again in the fall. We haven't decided yet whether we'll continue with these in the fall, but.
Great. Thanks everybody for coming. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right.